The development of stealth aircraft in the United States became a war between two companies, Lockheed and Northrop. In the previous video, we saw how Lockheed won the contract for the design of the F-117. Later on, Northrop would win the contract for the B-2 bomber, but before that, Northrop also won the contract to design an aircraft. Incredible, and that very few people know about. In fact, I have traveled to the United States just to be able to see it with my own eyes. So today I finally present to you Tacit Blue, the little whale. Why does this aircraft have the strangest geometry you will ever see? Why does Northrop's first stealth aircraft look nothing like Lockheed's first stealth aircraft? Or why do almost no people know about this plane? That's what you're about to find out. During the Cold War, Europe was divided. On one side were the NATO countries and their allies, and on the other side, the Soviet Union and other members of the Warsaw Pact. On the border between West Germany and East Germany, there was a corridor known as the Fulda Gap, where it was assumed that if the Soviets attacked NATO, they would take advantage of this corridor. You see, this area is somewhat mountainous, but there are a series of corridors that would allow Soviet tanks to pass through to Frankfurt, a financial city in West Germany. In addition, it was also a military center with many American bases, so NATO was aware that it was vital to keep that area well defended. The Red Army carried out staggered attacks. That's why, before the attack, they should concentrate all the tanks near the border, as far east as the logistics chain would allow. Then they would begin the attack with the first wave, while the others remained in the rear. The problem for NATO was that the area is very mountainous. Therefore, the defensive radars didn't allow them to know if the Soviets were mobilizing troops because the mountains limited their range. From the United States, an idea was proposed to use a radar on an aircraft to monitor these territories, and in the event of a tank grouping, guided bombs could be launched to destroy them. So the first thing needed was a radar that could go on a plane and was capable of detecting moving tanks. Additionally, to catch the Red Army by surprise, it was required that this aircraft have a tiny radar cross-section. So, at this point, the problem was the following. How do you design a plane that can carry a huge radar and is also undetectable? If you remember from the previous video, Northrop lost the contract for the first stealth aircraft in the United States, which ended up being the F-117. But to keep them researching this technology, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the agency dedicated to researching future technologies in the United States, asked them to continue their investigations about how to design a rectangular object that had low observability. This project was given the name Battlefield Surveillance Aircraft Experimental, which comes from Battlefield Surveillance Aircraft Experimental. And pay attention, because this request for the project was made exclusively to Northrop. In other words, even though they had lost the competition for the previous aircraft, a second project had just fallen from the sky for them. And all of this was because the United States didn't want its stealth capabilities to depend solely on one company, Lockheed, which had already won the previous contract. This project gradually progressed and ended up becoming an aircraft. This aircraft became known as Tacit Blue. But, of course, they would have to design a surface for the aircraft that could block enemy radar waves, but still be able to emit and receive the radar waves from the aircraft itself. In addition, they would face an even greater challenge, making the aircraft's own radar signals undetectable. Yes, did you hear that right? Undetectable radar waves? This makes sense, because what good would it be to design a plane that was undetectable to radar? If it's going to be emitting waves, radar that the enemy is able to hear, even if they can't detect your plane, if they hear the radar waves, they'll know there's something out there. And for this, they wanted to use a new type of radar that was being researched by DARPAD. For a few years now, it had been known as Pave Mover. This radar was based on the Doppler effect to detect if there were enemy tanks in motion. That was the key to everything. The problem was that they couldn't aim the beam at a specific point because otherwise they could be detected. They had to keep moving it constantly. In addition, they had to make the signal change its frequency and amplitude continuously so the enemy wouldn't notice. And on top of all that, they had to add a completely unpredictable movement of the beam to be totally undetectable. The frequency spectrum they chose would range between 12 and 18 GHz. This type of waves would allow the use of a relatively small radar, something essential to be able to carry it inside an aircraft. And besides, this frequency wasn't used by Soviet radars, since it didn't work very well in heavy rain. But this didn't seem to be a problem in that particular part of the world. In fact, just so you understand how complex this is, a meteorological study was carried out in that part of the world to see what the probability was of that kind of rain occurring in that region of the planet. Finally, they realized that the rain was almost never intense enough in that area to interfere with radar signals. The idea behind this plane was amazing. It was supposed to follow a very elongated U-shaped trajectory, flying parallel to the front. Its task would be to analyze whether there was any movement from the Soviet tanks using its Doppler radar, and then send that information to the Allied side so that intelligence could analyze it. When it reached the end of its route, it would turn around and retrace the path, but in the opposite direction. This way, it would be possible to know at all times the state of the front and whether enemy troops were approaching or not. All of this was completely new for stealth aircraft, since the previous aircraft, the F-117, didn't have radar, precisely for this reason, to avoid being detected. Theoretically, the surface that minimizes the return of a radar signal is a flat plate. But that geometry can't be used for a real airplane, since there has to be space inside for antennas, the pilot, engines, and other systems. So a kind of box was chosen, with the bottom surface completely flat. The surfaces on the side of the fuselage were tilted 15 degrees from the vertical so that any radar signal coming from below would be deflected upward. The wing profile used for the aircraft was the one known as Clark-less fur, which was widely used in the 1920s. The reason it was used in this aircraft was because the underside was quite flat, which was extremely important for stealth purposes. Additionally, it had very good performance for the speed range at which this aircraft would operate. The rectangular shape of the fuselage had its explanation. On each side, there would be a radar, like the one I showed earlier, which had a rectangular shape. In fact, in the images of the plane, you can even see exactly where that antenna would go. That's why it was necessary for the aircraft to have this strange, box-like shape, since this plane was going to be flying all the time. Parallel, up front, its greatest stealth would have to be from the side. So they simply focused on that, but it's true that it was also specified that it should be stealthy, that it should be stealth. Also from the front and from behind, for when it made turns and so on, but the most important thing was from the side. As we explained in the first video of the series, Northrop, just like Lockheed, chose to create an aircraft with very sharp lines, assuming that there would be a direction in which all the reflected waves would go. But since the aircraft would mostly be flying sideways, it would be very difficult for a radar to lock onto it for a long enough period to detect it. Simply, the plane would just pass through the radar's horizon. When they started analyzing the aircraft, they realized it was anything but stable. A completely flat surface on the bottom would make it impossible for the plane to fly. So they had to give it some curve, even though this would increase the radar signature a bit. And with this plane, Northrop learned a lot about stealth and later went on to develop the B-2. For example, here they added a lot of curves to the rear section, and they also added a lot of curves to the engines. The front part is rectangular. You can see the plane there perfectly, yes? It's rectangular, it's very strange, very clear. Could you say that it's everything Northrop did wrong in the experimental survivable testbed competition? The plane, which later became the F-117, helped them become experts in stealth. First of all, Lockheed understood that the key to the project was to put people who understood electromagnetic waves in charge, not aerodynamicists. That's why the surfaces of the F-117 are so strange. Since Northrop didn't do this, their aerodynamic engineers learned through trial and error which aerodynamic surfaces would best minimize the radar signature. In addition, Lockheed was the first to use fly-by-wire to control the F-117, assuming it would be unstable. Northrop didn't do this. They forced their aircraft proposal to be stable, understanding aerodynamics behind these surfaces much better. As I said before, this project was assigned to Northrop by Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency without any competition or anything like that. But when the aircraft design was already very advanced, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency invited Lockheed to join the project and compete against Northrop's. At Northrop, they were stunned because from the very beginning, they understood that the plane was meant for them, so internally they considered making a bold move. The United States government wouldn't be interested in relying exclusively on one company for stealth technology. So basically, they told them that either Lockheed was out or they would leave. And their move worked out well because that was exactly what the government was afraid of, relying on just one company. But before all this unfolded, Lockheed had time to prepare a proposal. Since Lockheed's code only calculated with flat surfaces, they designed an aircraft proposal very similar to the F-117. But this time they made it a flying wing type, meaning it didn't have a tail. They considered the possibility of introducing curves, already knowing by that time that even some types of curves could be beneficial against radar signals. Besides, they would improve aerodynamic efficiency. But Lockheed would have had to invest a lot of money to test this in trials, and they preferred to stick with their straight surface design. This made the capabilities much worse than those of Tacit Blue, Northrop's design, so they were simply left out. There was no need to kick them out. It's often thought that in the stealth aircraft competition, Northrop chose the flying wing design. Unlike Lockheed, everyone knows about the little obsession this company had with tailless aircraft. You just have to look at the successful flying wing designs from the United States. They're all from Northrop, but actually, it was Lockheed who first suggested this type of aircraft when they were going to participate in the Battlefield Surveillance Aircraft Experimental Program. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency liked this idea, but it was too late to ask Northrop to apply it, so it would be left as a future task. The aircraft completed 135 flight tests and was later canceled. The last flight of the aircraft was in 1985, and the reason for canceling it is that they realized they didn't need a stealth aircraft to do these tasks. They could use a conventional aircraft with larger antennas that would fly a little farther to avoid being detected. And that's how the E-8C Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System project was created, a modification of a Boeing 707 that would carry these antennas on the underside. The E-8 was retired in the year 2023. Regarding Tacit Blue, only one prototype was built, and it is currently on display at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. This aircraft is really not very well known to the general public, and it's not very clear why. Only one prototype was made, so maybe that's the reason. But it's also said that it didn't get much publicity because it didn't come directly from the Air Force, but rather from Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's also said that it was a pretty ugly plane, you just have to look at it, so did they not want to give it publicity? When the project was canceled, the plane simply remained classified for many years, so it's also possible that's why it was forgotten. And it's known by two names, the Whale and Highly Unstable Mother, HUM. Highly Unstable Mother, basically, the very unstable mother. In any case, definitely one of my favorite aircraft so far. With this aircraft, Northrop was able to match its knowledge with Lockheed in terms of stealth technology. For example, Tacit Blue was already using fly-by-wire, which Northrop had refused to use in the previous program. From this, the United States got what they wanted, two companies to later go into the final competition, the nuclear strategic bomber. But we'll talk about that in the next video of this stealth series. Thank you very much for watching my videos.